They didn't fear the Mustang at first. Not really. In the early days, German fighter pilots looked at the sleek American newcomer and saw what they thought was just another Allied machine. One more airplane to swat out of the sky the way they had swatted so many others. They had faced Hurricanes, early Spitfires, P-47s, P-38s, and a constant stream of bombers that American doctrine insisted could defend themselves. The Luftwaffe had built a reputation on tearing apart daylight raids. German aces had the confidence of men who believed the sky belonged to them, and for a time over Europe it did. Then the P-51 arrived in numbers with the one thing the Luftwaffe could not outfly with courage or tactics alone: time over target, range, persistence. The ability to stay with the bombers all the way in and all the way out, and then go hunting on the way home. And once that happened, the German fighter force didn't just face a better opponent. It faced a new kind of war. The kind where the hunter becomes the hunted, where airfields aren't safe, where takeoffs become ambushes, where a battle isn't over when you break contact because the enemy has the fuel to follow you. That is the story of the P-51 Mustang in Europe. Not merely that it was fast, not merely that it was iconic, but that it changed the air war so completely that Hermann Göring himself was later quoted as saying that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the jig was up. German aces underestimated the P-51, and then they regretted it. To understand how that regret was built, you have to start with what the Mustang actually was, because the P-51's legend is often treated as if it appeared out of thin air, like a miracle airplane that saved the bomber war by simply showing up. The real story is more interesting because it is a story of speed, urgency, and unexpected evolution. The P-51 began as a British-driven requirement in 1940, when the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation to build Curtiss P-40s under license. North American didn't want to mass-produce an older design. It proposed something new and promised it could deliver it quickly. What followed was one of the most astonishing development sprints of the war. The prototype airframe was completed just 102 days after the contract was signed, and the aircraft was flying by late October 1940. It was sleek, efficient, designed around modern aerodynamic thinking, and built for mass production. And yet, the first Mustangs weren't the high-altitude escort legends people think of today. Early Mustangs used the Allison V1710 engine, which performed well at lower altitudes but struggled higher up where the decisive air battles over Europe were fought. The Royal Air Force used early Mustangs for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, exploiting their speed and range close to the ground. The Mustang was promising, but it wasn't yet the Luftwaffe's nightmare. The nightmare began when the engine changed. The breakthrough was fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a two-stage, two-speed, intercooled supercharged powerhouse that transformed high-altitude performance without sacrificing range. It wasn't a cosmetic upgrade. It was a different animal. When Merlin-powered Mustangs were tested in Britain, performance above 15,000 feet improved dramatically. North American and the U.S. Army Air Forces paid attention. That conversion produced the P-51B and P-51C, and then the definitive P-51D, powered by a Packard-built Merlin and armed with 6 .50 caliber machine guns. The P-51D also introduced the bubble canopy that improved pilot visibility. But the single most important feature wasn't the guns or the canopy. It was the combination of speed and range, amplified by the ability to carry external drop tanks and later, by the addition of an internal fuselage fuel tank that extended endurance even further. The Mustang could escort bombers to the heart of Germany and back. In the European Air War, that capability was not just useful, it was decisive. Now you have to place that capability into the situation the United States faced in 1943, because the P-51 did not become famous in a vacuum. It became famous because American doctrine was colliding with reality in a brutal way. Before the war, U.S. doctrine insisted The bomber will always get through, believing tight formations of heavily armed bombers could defend themselves, and that daylight precision bombing could cripple enemy industry. Early raids did not immediately refute this belief, partly because the scale was limited. But as the combined bomber offensive expanded and bombers went deeper into Germany, the Luftwaffe adapted. German fighters concentrated where they could do the most damage, beyond the range of Allied escort fighters. That's where the slaughter happened. Raids like Schweinfurt, Regensburg showed the crisis. B-17s being shot down in numbers so severe that the very concept of unescorted daylight bombing was called into question. The U.S. Army Air Forces had a strategic choice to make: abandon the doctrine and shift toward night bombing like the RAF, or find a fighter that could escort bombers all the way. They chose the second path, because the United States believed daylight precision bombing was essential, and because, culturally and institutionally, it was easier to demand a technological solution than to admit foundational doctrine was wrong. At first, the escort problem was handled by layering shorter-range fighters. P-38s and P-47s could escort bombers part of the way, then had to turn back, leaving bombers exposed in the deepest penetration. That gap was a killing zone. German pilots learned to wait for it. They could conserve fuel and strength and strike the bombers when escorts peeled off. In that environment, the bomber stream became a predictable hunt, and the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, though increasingly strained, could still inflict catastrophic losses. The P-51 closed that gap. It didn't just protect the bombers. It removed the predictable, safe space German fighters had been exploiting. It forced the Luftwaffe to fight with escorts present, deep in Germany, far from the comfort of choosing the moment. It made the bomber war sustainable long enough to grind the Luftwaffe down. But the real shock for German pilots wasn't only that the Mustang could escort. It was what happened when American commanders changed how escorts were used. In early 1944, Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and did something that bomber crews initially hated, but that ultimately won the air war. He released fighters from the strict requirement to stay glued to bomber formations. Mustang groups were sent ahead in fighter sweeps. They were told, in effect, to hunt the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. This was a strategic shift from defense to offense. It meant the mission was no longer merely protect the bombers. The mission became destroy the Luftwaffe. Bomber crews complained because they sometimes saw fewer fighters close by when the German formations approached, and in the short term, that fear made sense. But the long-term result was air supremacy. By June 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was so strong that the Normandy invasion could proceed under a protective umbrella. The Mustang was not the only reason this happened, but it was the aircraft that made Doolittle's strategy feasible at scale, because it had the range to sweep ahead, fight, and still return. This is where German aces began to regret the earlier underestimation. The Mustang's presence changed the Luftwaffe's risk calculation. Twin-engine heavy fighters like the Bf-110, used as bomber destroyers, became easy prey for Mustangs and had to be withdrawn from the role. The FW-190A, already challenged at high altitudes, struggled against the Mustang where the bombers flew. The Bf-109 could still compete in performance, especially in certain regimes of speed and climb, but it was increasingly constrained by the demands of carrying heavier armament to attack bombers, by fuel shortages, by pilot training decline, and by the growing tactical pressure of fighting Mustangs in the very airspace Germany was trying to defend. German pilots could still outturn a Mustang in some situations. They could sometimes fight their way through. But the war was changing into a war of attrition, and the Mustang was one of the main tools of that attrition. German pilots themselves acknowledged the Mustang's difficulty. Heinz Baer, a German ace, later said the P-51 was perhaps the most difficult of all Allied aircraft to meet in combat. Fast, maneuverable, hard to see, difficult to identify because it resembled the Bf-109 at a distance. That last detail matters more than it sounds like it should. In air combat, identification and reaction time are life and death. If an aircraft can close quickly and you hesitate because you misread it, you can die. Kurt Buchleichen, another high-scoring German pilot, said they could outturn the P-51 and that German cannon were stronger. But even in that admission, you can hear the defensive logic. Yes, we could outturn it, but that doesn't mean we could escape it, because speed and initiative often matter more than turning radius when the enemy chooses when to engage. And Allied test pilots were candid too. Captain Eric Brown, one of the most experienced test pilots of the era, said the Mustang was the best escort because of its incredible range and the best American dogfighter, even though he personally would prefer a Spitfire in a pure turning fight. Then he delivered the sentence that perfectly summarizes why the Mustang mattered. He wouldn't want to be in a dogfight near Berlin in a Spitfire because he could never get home. That is the point. The Mustang didn't need to be the tightest turning fighter in the sky. It needed to be there, over Berlin, over the bomber streams, over the German airfields, day after day, until German pilots could no longer assume they could wait out the escorts. As the Mustang's pressure increased, the Luftwaffe tried to adapt tactically with new formations. One response was the Gefechtsverband, built around a Sturmgruppe of heavily armored and heavily armed FW-190s, intended to smash through bomber formations, escorted by Bf-109s whose job was to keep the Mustangs away. This was a clever idea on paper. Create a hammer, the armored FW-190s, and protect it with a shield, the Bf-109 escorts. But it was difficult to execute. Large formations took time to assemble and were hard to maneuver, making them vulnerable to Mustang fighter sweeps that could intercept them before they reached the bombers. And as American strategy increasingly targeted not only fighters in the air, but the Luftwaffe's ability to generate sorties at all, the Luftwaffe's tactical innovations collided with a more devastating reality. Airfields were becoming battlefields. Beginning in early 1944, Allied fighters began systematic strafing and attacks on German airfields and infrastructure. The goal was not merely to win dogfights, it was to cripple the Luftwaffe as a system. If fighters could not take off safely, if fuel trucks and maintenance crews and runways and parked aircraft were destroyed, then the Luftwaffe could not sustain defense. The P-51 played a central role in these operations, and this is one of the reasons German pilots' regret became existential. It is one thing to lose a fight in the air. It is another thing to realize you are being hunted on the ground, that your base is no longer a sanctuary, and that even your takeoff and landing windows are dangerous. Later in the war, American pilots learned to stalk German jets like the Me-262 during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing, because the early jet engines required careful handling, and the aircraft were difficult to protect during those phases. Mustangs shot down jets on approach. Mustangs surprised jets on takeoff. Mustangs turned technological revolution into another kind of trap. This is the kind of warfare the Mustang enabled. Persistent, deep, ruthless pressure that attacked the enemy's ability to exist as an air force. The Luftwaffe had one final response: build machines so fast that even the Mustang couldn't easily catch them, like the Me-262 jet fighter. And the Me-262 was a serious threat in theory. But in practice, it came too late, in too few numbers, under conditions of fuel shortage, pilot shortage, and constant Allied attack on airfields. The Mustang's presence didn't make the Me-262 irrelevant, but it helped neutralize it by making the jet's vulnerable phases deadly. In October 1944, Mustangs shot down Me-262s as they took off. Later, Mustangs caught them in patterns that made clear the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the rhythm of operations. A high-performance aircraft is not a war-winning weapon if it cannot be sustained, fueled, trained, protected, and deployed at scale. The Mustang and the broader Allied air campaign denied Germany the ability to do those things. By mid-1944, the fighter threat to Allied bombers diminished dramatically. The RAF, which had favored night bombing partly for protection from fighters, was able to reopen more daylight operations because the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had been crippled. This is where the Mustang's legend becomes more than a pilot's story. It becomes a strategic reality. When the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies effectively, Allied operations on the ground became possible at scale. The Normandy invasion depended on air supremacy. The ability to move armies, supply lines, and reinforcements without being shredded by enemy air power mattered enormously. The Mustang contributed to creating that condition, not as the only factor, but as the long-range escort and offensive fighter that helped break German air defense. And this brings us to the emotional heart of why German aces regretted underestimating the P-51. They were not foolish men. Many were highly skilled, brave, and experienced. But they had fought a certain kind of air war and had built confidence around predictable patterns, escorts that had to turn back, bombers that would be exposed, airfields that offered sanctuary, the ability to choose when to engage. The Mustang broke those patterns. It erased the safe distance between the battle and German home airspace. It made the bomber war a constant presence rather than a periodic incursion. It forced German fighters to fight when the Americans wanted them to fight, and to risk being hunted even when they tried to avoid combat. It attacked not just aircraft but the Luftwaffe's entire operating system. That is why the regret became so profound. The Mustang did not simply beat individual pilots. It helped collapse a system. When people talk about Mustang kill counts and aces, it can sound like a scoreboard, but the scoreboard reflects the deeper truth. By the end of the war, P-51 groups claimed thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground. The Mustang became a central tool in achieving Allied air supremacy. The names of aces like George Preddy, the top-scoring Mustang ace, or famous pilots like Chuck Yeager, who shot down Me-262s, are part of the legend. But the real story is collective. It is the story of fighter groups converting to Mustangs because the aircraft gave them the range and performance to fight where the war was decided. It is the story of pilots trained not only to escort but to hunt, supported by tactics and tools like improved gun sights and training programs that sharpened effectiveness. It is the story of relentless pressure until the Luftwaffe was no longer the terrifying force it had been. And if you want a final image that captures why German aces regretted underestimating the P-51, make it this. A German pilot in 1943 looking at a bomber stream and thinking the escorts will turn back, the target zone will open, the hunt will begin. And then the same pilot in 1944 looking up and realizing the escorts did not turn back, that Mustangs are circling where they never used to be, that the Americans have the fuel to stay, that the airfield behind him is not safe, and that even Berlin is no longer protected by distance. That realization is what Goering's quote captures. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. The Mustang was not magic. It was engineering, production, strategy, and sacrifice combined into an aircraft that arrived at the exact moment the air war demanded it. The Luftwaffe underestimated it because they underestimated the importance of range and persistence, and they underestimated America's ability to turn a good design into a mass-produced instrument of strategic pressure. They regretted it because once the Mustang was in the sky in numbers, the rules changed. And in war, when the rules change against you, skill alone can't save you.